This is Bitnar Talks, the engineer takes on construction. Episode 18. Hi, I'm Piotr Bitnar. Each day I help my clients plan and design building projects through Bitnar Limited, a consulting chartered structural engineer's practice. My biggest passion and the cornerstone on which I've built my business is finding clever solutions for construction projects. I am a chartered structural engineer and a budding software developer, so you can rest assured that I will strive to talk about the best practices and the use of new technologies in the industry. And if you're embarking on a construction project or are involved in planning, designing and building the world around us, you'll find this podcast useful. Approved Document B, Fire Safety Volume 2, Part 1. Hi there, and welcome to Bitnar Talks, your favorite podcast on all matters of architecture, engineering and construction. It is Thursday the 30th of May 2024, and I'm here back with you with the 18th episode and further information on fire safety in dwellings. Today, I'll move along to Volume 2 of the Approved Document B and talk about the discharge of building regulation concerning buildings other than dwellings. Last week, in episode 17, I talked about the requirement B5, access and facilities of Volume 1 for the fire service, what type of information is required in line with Regulation 38, and told you what is hidden in the appendices, which are shared between the volumes. The episode told you about the consideration and provisions required for vehicle and appliance access so that the firefighting crew is able to sufficiently fight the fire, provisions and distances of water outlets and backup inlets, whether in the form of hydrant or dry or wet fire main. I talked about the protected shafts and provisions for heat and smoke ventilation to basements, as well as the required information about the systems, layouts, construction, capacity, and strategies for when the fire breaks out. In this episode, I will cover requirements B1, means of warning and escape, and B2, internal fire spread linings of the Volume 2, and the introduction to the document covering sections 0 to 6. So without further ado, let's dive into the fire safety requirements B1 and B2 of Volume 2. Now, this material is about buildings other than dwellings, which consideration is covered in Volume 2 of the Approved Document B. It consists of 20 sections covering guidance on all the requirements of the building regulations and appendices which are mutual for both the Volume 1 dwellings as well as Volume 2 buildings other than dwellings. So I will not be coming back to them again in this material. Today, I will cover sections 0 to 6, which will include the requirements B1, means of warning and escape, and the requirement B2, internal fire spread linings. I will start with section 0 that covers the general information and the approach that should be taken in consideration whilst using the guidance of the document. Section 1 to 5 will cover fire detection and alarm systems, horizontal and vertical escape routes, guidance on small premises and general provisions, whereas section 6 will cover wall and ceiling linings. It is important to know why and how we should use the guidance and what level of consideration we ought to have when approaching specification and design of buildings other than dwellings. What classes of buildings are considered and how does the specification varies between them. Alright then, so let's dive straight into it, shall we? This material is about buildings other than dwellings, which consideration is covered in Volume 2 of the Approved Document B. It covers guidance on discharging requirements B1 to B5 and Regulations 38 of building regulations. and describes the assumptions made when forming the guidance. Mentions of section 0 of things like the management of the premise, which is not covered in the regulation, but the regulation assumes the proper considerations are put in place and maintained by the building owner, and where the failure to do so may be prosecuted on the basis of other legislation. It needs to be understood that the guidance concentrates on the life safety, not the premise protection, so further and more stringent approach may be needed to address these aspects. The Fire Protection Association would be the best place to go for more information on that. The guidance aims to be inclusive, so to cater for most people in most situations. Therefore, exclusion of the building users should not form part of the considerations, except in special cases, and there also may be such special cases that the guidance does not cover, but the design approach should cater for. So don't follow it blindly, look at it holistically, don't exclude people that use this building, and you should be good to go. As with the previous volume, alternative approach to the guidance can be made, but will need to be minimum equally safe to that contained within the guidance of the approved document, and should form a coherent, holistic whole. Some special consideration will be needed for the buildings containing more hazardous operations, like battery producers, fireworks, power plants, and whatnot. Special consideration should follow healthcare premises and the information contained within the Department of Health publication, which is called Fire Code. Unsupervised group homes should either follow the Department of Health Technical Memorandum 88, dealing with fire precautions in housing, providing NHS support in living in the community for small buildings, and otherwise treated as a purpose group 2B. Shopping complexes or buildings with atria passing through compartment floors are better treated with approach of the British Standard 9999, as are the assembly buildings, but some special consideration needs to be taken in line with the Safety of the Sports Grounds Act 1975. Schools, on the other hand, are covered in the Building Bulletin 100. Special considerations are also due to prisons, which are exempt from the consideration of the building regulations, but the approach is regulated by separate legislation, and the correct approach can be found in the HMPPS Custodial Premises Fire Safety Design Guide. Some leeway can be found when approaching historical buildings, but as ever, if there is an issue or ambiguity, the only solution for the specification may be the approach of the fire safety engineering and guidance covered in British Standard 7974 and ancillary supporting published documents. I've mentioned the purpose group when assigning risk level to the assisted living premises. That is what purpose groups are for. They group typical buildings into risk classifications, and there are 7 groups total, but 6 in the volume 2 of the approved documents. And these are Group 2, residential, where people sleep overnight. Type A, institutional, and Type B, other. Group 3, offices. Group 4, shop and commercial spaces. Group 5, assembly and recreation. Group 6, industrial. Group 7, storage and other non-residential, which further divides into Group 7A, any buildings not in Group 1 to 6 and not 7B, and 7B gives special provision to car parks for small vehicles up to 2.5 ton gross weight. As ever, if there is mixed use in play, the consideration should be divided if the ancillary space is large enough or is between flats and other groups. If in doubt, use the more stringent approach. In complicated circumstances, the requirements may well fall outside of the general guidance, and the approach of other approved documents and the fire safety engineering principles may be necessary to assure the fire safety. So, Off to our first requirement. Requirement B1. Means of warning and escape. As ever, let's start with finding out what the legislation requires of us in its wording. So, means of warning and escape. B1. The building shall be designed and constructed so that there are appropriate provisions for the early warning of fire and appropriate means of escape in case of fire from the building to a place of safety outside the building, capable of being safely and effectively used at all material times. It seems to be relatively simple, right? And the Secretary of State is also of simple intention here. Just as long as there is enough of warning and safe and well-signed escape route that people of different capabilities can use unaided, the requirement is pretty much covered. Naturally, this will mean many different things to many different buildings and their complexities, but that is why there are purpose groups in place to make it a little bit simpler. Section 1 deals with the fire detection and alarm systems. In the gist, the alarm needs to be sufficient, so if you work in the car garage, it may be enough to shout that there is a fire in a corner or there's a fire of a car and everyone will know, but as we go more complicated, more onerous provisions will need to be put in place. Fire detection systems should be automatic and form controlled networks of sensors, either heat, smoke, gas or radiation, or activated through sprinkler system. This will be mandatory in residential type scenarios, but will follow different consideration in other purpose groups. Generally speaking, if there is a room where people rarely go to, where there can be fire, and it will inhibit escape from the building, the appropriate system should be in place to alarm people of such event, or where the building is otherwise secured for entry or has the pressure differential system counteracting ingress of smoke into the escape way, such should be provided. The selection of systems should follow British Standard 5839, which categorizes different systems into 3 different categories, L, M, and P. Category L is for the protection of life, which further spreads into 5 levels of consideration, with most stringent being L1, which is a throughout system. L2 is defined part system. L3, early stage warning to allow escape route. L4 is escape route system. And L5, specific fire objective. Category M treats on manual fire detection and alarm systems, and category P is about property safety, further divided into P1 and P2, P1 being installed through the building and P2 installed in defined parts of the building. With the category in mind, it needs to be established what goes where and how the alarm should be sounded, which will be different between the stage and simultaneous evacuation plans, or where there are a large amount of people and where they are not aware how to behave in that building in the event of fire. Provision for visual alarms for hearing impaired people or personal vibrating paging systems may also be appropriate in certain circumstances. In any case, the design, installation and maintenance of the system, as well as its interface with other systems, should be controlled to assure on its reliability. For certain limits of student flats accommodation, there also should be a separate automatic detection system in each individual flat. Leaving the alarm consideration behind, Section 2, designed for horizontal escape, deals with an immediate escape route to the exit or protected stairway. The principle of the approach is if anyone gets confronted with fire, they can turn away from the fire and escape safely. If the building is not larger than 2 stories plus a basement story, and no story is larger than 280 meters squared, the building will be considered small and slightly lax approach can be taken. When considering escape route, we need to consider the number of people needing to vacate the space and their travel distance to the nearest exit, as well as how many vertical escape routes there are, so that access is possible for both from any point of the space. Also, there needs to be a separate escape route for dwellings, flats, and assembly and recreation spaces in the mixed-use buildings. When it comes to the number of escape routes, single routes are allowed with limitation of distance and on the number of people who will have to traverse it. Typically 30 people maximum rooms limits for residential and institutional, and 60 people rooms for bars and assembly places, and 60 people maximum occupation for single story. Distance limits start at 9 meters from the dead end in residential, disabled people buildings, and place special fire hazards to 60 meters in the open air. Consequently, the distances can be extended for escape in more than one direction, starting at 80 meters to 100 meters in the open air. There are rules how to measure these distances and limits to relative position between the relative routes, like minimum 45-degree angle between the points of turn and routes to turn of the route to alternative exits. The minimum number of escape routes is associated to the number of occupants, so 1 is enough for 60 people, 2 is enough between 60 and 600 people, and 3 are for more than 600 people. In most cases, the amount of the escape route will be governed by the distance traveled though. Inner rooms are allowed but should either have alternative exits or in line with the limits imposed by the guidance. In the gist, people should be able to see if the fire starts in the access room and be able to leave, so the room cannot host too many people. 30 people in case of residential use and 60 in other cases. Exits in the central course should be separated by corridor or lobby. Escape routes should be away from the openings in the story or does not go through the zone of 4.5 meter offsetting around the opening. Access to alternative story exits can be through protected lobbies but not through the other protected stairway. It is also important to separate circulation routes from protected stairways but by at least means of self-closing fire doors with automated release mechanisms. Meaning, if there is some sort of circuit failure or an event of fire, the doors will be released to enclose the protected stairway. Stories of mixed use or occupancy may require consideration of separation and alternative exits, like in case of restaurants or bar, or be divided by the at least protected corridor with provisions for automatic fire detection and alarm. Width of escape route starts at 750 millimeters, or 530 if you count the space between fixed storage racking, to slightly over 1 meter for up to 220 people using the route. Over this limit, the limit of 220 people traversing the exit, we need to allow for 5 millimeters per person. For alternative routes, we should discount 1 as it may be blocked, so the story may need to use alternative only, and that alternative needs to be capable of allowing enough people through. Similarly, for the final exit, which will need to accommodate the story load of people plus the stairway. So how to establish the lobby exit width? Well, in the worst case scenario, it should be of the story exit width summed up with the stairs width, but can be smaller in certain conditions and needs to follow the formula, which is basically 75% of the stair width plus 0.5% of the number of people served by that story exit. Corridors need to be protected when serving bedrooms or mixed occupancy and dead ends of more than 2 meter depth. In other cases where they do not need to be fire rated, they need to provide enough division to stop smoke penetration at or over the ceiling level. For dead ends, corridors of over 4.5 meters, we are guided to provide protected access to the point of alternative exits access. Escape through the external routes or flat roofs is possible with certain limits, like if protected within 1.8 meter of route horizontally and 1.1 meter vertically, and of fire rated construction in case of the roof. Also, the roof route needs to be one of the alternative routes and cannot be specified in residential institutional buildings and where the members of public use the building. Special considerations are needed for the buildings where people will need to be assisted to live, like in cases of residential care homes where progressive horizontal evacuation strategy may be needed. If the fire code document applies, its recommendation should be used instead. The PHG strategy requires more often compartmentalization to allow incremental movement of people from the area with fire to the next compartment. Bedrooms should form compartments as well as ancillary rooms where the fire can start, and the care house should be fitted with the highest level of alarm class L1, in line with BS 5839. Installation of sprinkler system allows for more design freedom in this type of circumstances. Now off to section 3, design for vertical escape. In the GIS, there needs to be enough stairs and of easy use to allow the escape even for people with restrained mobility. So if the building is fine for use of the single stairway for each story, such building can be served by single stairway within the additional limits for vertical escape routes. Generally, small and not complicated buildings with story level under 11 meters over the ground level, or small offices up to 5 stories with stories over the 11 meter having separate provisions for escape. Refuge should be provided at each usable story protected area or via stairway, and to meet certain criteria including marking and provision of emergency voice communication systems. The width of the escape stairs is regulated but will follow the consideration of number of people to be evacuated, modes of evacuation, whether simultaneous or staged, width of access doors, purpose group, and so on. There is more than one staircase for each evacuation scenario. One staircase should be incapacitated in any given scenario. The calculation of capacities are shown in the approved document. Additionally, rules on the material use, typically A2, S3, D2, ladder use, single step, and helical or spiral stairs is also mentioned. Generally, the provision of fire-resistant construction of the enclosure should be observed. External staircase can be used if there are also internal alternatives. External staircase needs to be positioned within fire protected zone of 1 meter down, 1.8 meter either side, and 1.1 meter to the top, and protected from elements if higher than 6 meters. Use of protected lobbies and corridors accessing protected stairways is generally considered a good idea, but it does not need to be the case in line with the guidance. If the protected stairways adjoin, their enclosures should not be perforated. There are some provisions of having access to toilets or reception desk as well as gas installation within those stairways, but all these come with further considerations. Interestingly, for single protected stairways serving upper floors, this needs to terminate at the ground level, and separate provisions should be made for the escape from basement. Some different approaches could be observed in section 4, dealing with small premises. The small premise is such of single occupancy of no more than 3 story, including single basement story and a first story, and of a size that, if not divided, would allow clear view of all the parts of the story, so taking the limit of 280 meters squared max. The area of the story should be generally undivided, except for ancillary spaces and storerooms, which should be fire rated. As with any other case, maximum travel distances, number of staircases, and the enclosure is regulated by the guidance. In section 5, which deals with general provision for protected escape routes, whether horizontal or vertical, and service installation, the performance for fire resistance and doors of the enclosure is available in Appendix B and C, and glazings that forms part of these enclosures are also treated within the appendices. If the glazing unit can provide enough integrity and insulation, there is no restriction on its use. Doors should be easy to use and operate its locking, opening and closing mechanisms, and to be of appropriate fire rating. Doors should generally open in the direction of exit, and revolving and automatic doors are allowed. However, alternative escape or opening needs to be put in place. Escape routes should be at least 2 meters high, but could be a bit less at the door frames in any way, should allow easy exit by most people over the surface that does not promote slip, trips and falls. Final exits should be of the right capacity, well lit and signed and inclusive for disabled people. Requirements for different purpose groups are contained within the guidance. Some further consideration of placement and protection of protected power circuits should be given so to mitigate failure of the system. When it comes to lifts, it is generally advised not to use them in the event of fire, but certain provisions may need to be made and the lift adapted for evacuation, or provisions made for the use of the firefighting lifts for the evacuation. Lift enclosure and shaft should follow the enclosure requirements dependent on the type and position of the lift, as well as the possibility of the spread of smoke through the lift to protected shaft. It is advised to have the operating room either at the top of the shaft or separated if the top installation cannot be achieved. Refuse chutes and storage is to be constructed to British Standard 5906. They should be separated from the other parts of buildings with either RAID 30 for small buildings with top story under 5 meters above ground level, or RAID 60 construction, and to be accessed directly from the open air or through ventilated lobby. Walk-in and fully enclosed shop rooms should be separated from the retail area with fire-resistant construction minimum RAID 30 if the fire within would impact the means of escape, unless they are fitted with automated fire detection and alarm systems or are fitted with sprinklers. So this is it with requirement B1. Now let's have a look what the legislator prepared for us in the requirement B2, internal fire spread linings. So B2, there are 2 points in the legislation. Point 1 further divides into A and B. So point 1, to inhibit the spread of fire within the building, the internal lining shall A, adequately resist the spread of flame over the surface, and B, have, if ignited, either a rate of heat release or a rate of fire growth which is reasonable in the circumstances. And point 2, in this paragraph, internal linings means the materials or products used in linings any partition, wall, ceiling or other internal structure. This one is all about assuring that what is put on the wall and ceilings does not fuel the fire and the spread of fire is somehow restricted. So section 6 tells us what wall and ceiling linings are acceptable, the worst classification being DS3D2 and best BS3D2. So between medium to very limited contribution to fire material, but smoke and droplets could be as heavy as they get. Some relaxation on parts of the wall can be introduced, but with limited area limitation, and being the worst case scenario of DS3D2. Similarly, with ceiling Mentioned is special provisions that are made for ceilings in protected stairways. Consideration of thermoplastic use in windows and roof lights, the use of light diffusers, and the use of suspended or stretched skin ceilings, recognizing different limits depending on different types of thermoplastics. Additionally, flexible membrane covering or PTFE based materials are referred to be treated with the approach shown in British Standard 7157 or BRE Report BR274. The use of insulated co-panels also gets their attention, as does the fixings and possible delamination of the panel when heated. So this is it, folks. First part of the approved document B Volume 2 is under the belt. Volume 2 of the approved document B provides guidance on fire safety for non-dwelling buildings, focusing on requirements B1 to B5 and Regulation 38 of the building regulations. The primary concern is life safety, not property protection. The guidance assumes building owners will maintain proper management practices, though these are not directly regulated. Key consideration of the requirements are inclusivity, alternative approaches, and special consideration for special buildings. Buildings are classified into 6 purpose groups for risk assessment, group 2 to 7, for covering residential, institutional and other, office, shop and commercial, assembly and recreation, industrial, storage and other non-residential, including car parks for small vehicles. Mixed-use buildings should apply more stringent measures where necessary. Complex situations may require fire safety engineering to BS 7974 and ancillary published documents. Requirement B1 means of warning and escape tells us that buildings must have adequate early fire warning system and safe escape routes. Fire detection systems should be automated and follow BS 5839 standard. Categorization follows life protection, Class L, manual detection, Class M, and protective protection, Class P. In Section 1, Fire Detection and Alarm Systems, we find out that system must be appropriate for the building complexity, designed, installed and maintained. In Section 2, Design for Horizontal Escape, we find out that escape routes must consider occupant numbers, travel distances, and protections like fire doors and corridors. There may be special rules applicable to single and alternative escape routes, inner rooms and protected stairways. Section 3, Design of Vertical Escape, tells us that we should take special provisions for providing sufficient escape stairs, that we should identify redundancies of the escape route system in any event of fire. For Section 4, Small Premises, we find out some special rules for smaller buildings of up to 3 stories with 1 over and 1 underground, and 280 meters square of maximum story floor area. And we find out the general provisions for protected escape routes that include fire resistance enclosures, easy to use doors, final exit provisions, protected power circuits, lifts and refuse chutes, and how to treat them in the backdrop of the regulation, the requirement of the regulation. Requirement B2 then, internal fire spread linings, tells us that the linings must resist flame spread and maintain reasonable heat release and fire growth rates. Classifications range from D-S3, D2, which are medium contribution, to B-S3, D2 with limited contribution. Special considerations are given to thermoplastic materials, insulated core panels, and their fixings. This document ensures non-dwelling buildings adhere to essential fire safety standards. It emphasizes early warning, safe escape routes, and proper internal lining to inhibit fire spread. In the next episode, we move to requirement B3 to B5 and regulation 38, section 7 to 19. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that the consideration of Fire Safety Volume 2 requirements B1 and B2 are now more clear and comprehensible for you. If you have any questions, reach out to me on LinkedIn or send me an email. I'm more than happy to help you out. In Bitna, we deal with planning, designing and managing of your projects, and we are always glad to facilitate a free initial consultation to steer you in the right direction. Visit www.bitna.co.uk and reach out to us. Whether your question is if we can help you with your project or what should I do, we will be able to give you a piece of non-obligatory advice. At Bitna, we help our clients design and execute their dream homes or investments. If your building is falling apart, we can also help investigate the reasons behind it and to provide you with an appropriate strategy, design and specifications for the repair. Thank you again for listening. Please voice up your opinions. I'm waiting for you on LinkedIn and I want to hear from you. See you next week. And remember, Bitna designs the world around you. Toodaloo!